In the 1990s, Toyota created easily one of the most iconic cars of all time in the form of the Toyota Mark IV Supra. But when the Mark IV sadly disappeared from our horizons in the early thousands, many wondered what would happen if they made a Mark V. Now obviously here in 2021, we know what the Mark V looks like. But upon seeing the Mark V, many of us began to wonder, is this the real successor to the Mark IV? Or have we had a Mark IV this whole time and just never recognized it for what it was? And with that said, today we're going to be talking about the Lexus LC500. So let's talk this out. We've got a car that's known on every continent in the world to be an incredibly good tuner car, very fast, very well built, perfectly good engineering involved. And then we've got a big luxury coupe, which is what LC stands for. How in the world do we bridge the gap between the two to say that, yeah, this should have become this instead of what the Mark V already is? After all, the Mark V is an incredibly good car once you get past all the Beamer jokes and whatnot and you actually drive it. It's got a lot of power, and while it doesn't have a manual in the straight 6 format anyway, yeah, what gives? Why would we say that an LC500, which is a huge car, should be the spiritual successor of the Mark IV Supra? Well, let me tell you a quick story to help fill you in, because I know this is a whole slew of controversy right here. You see, way back in 2016, this car was unveiled at the North American International Auto Show in Detroit, and it was announced that it was the replacement for the SC300 platform, or as some people in the world might know it, the Soarer. It's a good looking car, stout, mean, sleek, it looks great, it sounds great, and having interacted with it in person, it's incredibly fast and a car that I would not shake a fist at, even in my Evo, just because that torque is spot on. Just an incredibly good, well-tuned machine. After all, Lexus is known for their V8 tech, and if you don't believe me, go look up what every iteration of the 1UZ and all that is. There's so much there, and all that tech got poured straight into this new 5-liter, well, was new 5-liter V8, giving it just tons of power and a whole lot of presence. Now, while many people discredit the SC300 and Soarer platforms for being poor man Supras, kind of like the IS300, there is so much there for a good sports car. And a lot of those cars shared some monikers and little tidbit things here and there with the Supra. There were tiny details that you could see if you really took a designer brain and translated it onto the Supra. You would see certain body lines and certain looks that definitely were shared between the two models. After all, the Supra was meant to be a flagship, whereas the Soarer was meant to be more of an entry-level project for someone to get into. It wasn't something that was super high tier like unfortunately many of us Americans treat Lexus. It was really meant for the average Joe to get into, to have a good sports car with some of that same technology, just not quite exactly the same. You know, you gotta keep the flagship for a reason. So how is the LC500 the Supra successor? After all, we just talked about how it's not a Supra, so why would we say that it's the successor to it? Well, in a lot of ways, this car just screams at me that the Supra is related to it. And if you don't believe me, look at its body lines. Look at the way that it sits on the road. Look at how it's set up. If you take out the very clear Lexus design house influence on that car, you've got a Supra. You've got the long hood. You've got the slanted back and narrow cockpit. You've got that incredibly comfortable seating position for the driver. Everything about this car completely took notes from the Supra. And if you don't believe me, I mean, look at the pictures for yourself. This thing is totally a Lexus suited up Supra. Sure, it's got the Lexus V8 under the hood. Sure, there's things that don't entirely line up, and obviously you're not going to find a lot of parts that are shared between them, but when it comes to a spiritual successor, it doesn't necessarily mean it's an identical successor. Even the Mark V, which has now been labeled as the successor, just doesn't have some of that same heritage. There are details that are shared, for sure. You can see it once you look at it long enough that there are bits and pieces of the Mark V that can be found on a Mark IV and vice versa. But the LC500, you take out all the angular lines and everything else, there's a Supra hiding under that shell. And as a result, I feel like people need to give this car another shot, especially in the aftermarket community. So many people are focused on every other Lexus besides these high-end ones. I get it, they're expensive. At $93,000 for a starting price on one of these newer ones, yeah, it's not a cheap car. After all, it is a Lexus. But there's something to be said about how this car behaves. And if you're in the bracket to buy one, I'd say go for the LC over the Mark V. I'll be honest, if I were in the position to buy either of these cars, after all, they are both very expensive and quite costly to get and or maintain, I'd honestly rather go with the LC500. Don't get me wrong, I love the way the Mark V looks, I love the way it sounds, its engineering is quite good, even if it is partnered with a company notorious for problems with their cars. That Mark V has a lot of good things going for it, but there's something about the soulfulness that the LC500 brings to the table that just completely takes the Mark V off the plate. There's nothing that I could really say that would change my mind from wanting to get a Mark V if I could, for the same cost, get an LC500. There's just something about the LC500's simple elegance and refinement and crazy good engineering from Lexus that really delivers what in my head the Mark IV was really meant to deliver. After all, people like myself weren't necessarily the original target market for the Mark IV. It was meant for people who were trying to find something to, say, take out Porsches, right? Not other tuner cars. It wasn't even really looking at Japan for its competition, and yet it found itself amongst some of the greatest names in Japanese car culture. And I feel like the LC500, while also not in the name of some top Japanese cars right now, given enough people investing and wanting to try their hand at that car, I feel like maybe someday it'll have some of that same just self-respect that the Mark IV had, that carried it all the way to its eternal stardom. And with that said, what do you think? Have I convinced you? Have I completely changed your mind? Let me know down below. And yeah, would you get an LC500 if you had the money, or would you rather spend it on something else? But with all that said, thank you all for watching. God bless you guys. Again, let us know your opinions down below. I do read every single comment, or at least as many as I can. And we'll see you guys on another episode. God bless and peace.